One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and is the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. This is part 2 of a mini-series on resistance training that I'm calling Embracing Strength. And one of the things that I hope that you remember from the last episode, which was the first in the mini-series, is that when it comes to muscle, you use it or you lose it. Kind of an overused phrase, but it's true. Unless you're doing a certain weekly volume of resistance training, then every year after about the age of 40, you lose approximately 1 to 2% of your muscle mass, 2 to 4% of your physical speed, and most significantly, you lose up to 10% of your muscular power. And that's every single year that you're not doing something to prevent that. Now, if you're under 40 and resistance training is not part of your lifestyle, then you really need to waste no time, right? You need to start the habit of resistance training now, because it's a lot easier to keep what you build before you're 40 than having to start from scratch when you're 50, 60, 70, even 80 years old. And if you're over 40 and you don't currently train with resistance, you need to start today. Even if you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s, it's never, ever too late to start. And you can do some quick math in your head to figure out how much you may have lost since you turned 40 if you're over 40. And if that turns out to be a lot, then don't panic. We have all kinds of studies that confirm that you can add muscle strength and power even in your 80s, as long as you train frequently and as long as your protein intake is high enough. And that's important because as we get older, we actually need more protein, not less, if we're going to preserve not just our muscle mass, but our strength and our power as well. But really, do you need to do the math? Probably not. You can probably just do an honest inventory of your current physique and your current physical capacity and kind of know where you stand. Do you think you're as strong as you should be? Are you as strong as you used to be? And project 20 years down the road from where you are right now and ask yourself what your capacity is going to be if you don't start doing something about it now, because you will lose more mass, strength, and power as you age unless you're proactive. And as always, if you decide to implement any of the strategies that you hear me talk about on this podcast, then please make sure that you're being smart and that you're being safe. Check with a qualified physician to make sure that resistance training is safe for you, given whatever medical restrictions that you might have. All right, let's talk about some really big picture stuff for a moment. I think that if you poll a bunch of middle-aged and older people who do resistance training and ask them why they do it, their answers are probably going to fall into one or more of 3 main things. It's either because they want to look good, feel good, or play good. And I stole that phrase from Andy Galpin. So Andy, if you ever listen to this, then you get the credit. And all of these are valid reasons, right? Look good, feel good, play good. And to be honest, I don't care what your motivation is. Whatever it takes to get you going is fine by me. Things will sort themselves out in the long run, but your motivation really makes no difference as long as you start doing it. And so whether your motivation is being able to pick up your grandchild, or maybe it's to look great at your next high school or college reunion, I don't really care, because no matter what goal that you have in mind that gets you started or keeps you doing it, there are a ton of things that happen inside your body and your brain that may have nothing to do with why you wanted to get started in the first place. And that's the cool thing about it. Like, doing it brings a lot of different benefit. Now, in my opinion, the benefits of resistance training lay in their potential to affect the entire neuroendocrine immune supersystem. And I went through the basics of the neuroendocrine immune supersystem in episode 2 a couple of years ago when I launched the podcast. So if you haven't heard about this, or if it's been a while, you might want to go back to episode 2 and brush up on that. But you need to know that whatever your initial motivation is for resistance training, There are distinct cognitive and emotional or mood benefits to exercise. We have multiple studies that show that there's improved mental performance after just a simple 20-minute exercise session. We know that exercise, including resistance training, is the only consistent effective treatment for depression. And that's comparing it to all other therapies, including cognitive behavioral therapy or counseling or medications. Exercise is the key. And resistance training can play a role in staving off neurodegeneration and cognitive decline that comes with that. It literally can help protect you from dementia and Alzheimer's. There are also hormonal benefits to exercise, particularly with the control of insulin and increased production of things like growth hormone. And we also have many studies that show that resistance training can improve the symptoms of premenstrual syndrome if you're a female and if you suffer from those things. And finally, there are major immune system benefits. When you contract your muscles against an external load, they release chemicals called myokines. And some of these myokines that your muscle releases under exercise are pretty much the same chemicals that are released by your immune system that enhances the function of things like natural killer and cytotoxic T cells, that enhances the functionality of regulatory T cells. And ultimately, this translates into a more efficient and better controlled immune system. The bottom line is you get sick less and you recover faster if you do get sick. And let me share this nugget with you. Like, we have research just from early 2023 published in the European Journal of Cardiology that shows if you have a heart attack, if you have strong legs or stronger legs, then you have a better prognosis, a better outcome after your heart attack. So having superior lower body strength and power means that you're less likely to develop complications and more likely to recover better and faster in the unfortunate circumstance if you end up having a myocardial infarction or heart attack. So clearly the benefits, the health benefits of having adequate muscle mass, adequate strength and power, they range very deep, they range very far and very wide. So what's your goal? Right? Do you simply want to look good? Do you want to feel better? Do you want to be able to engage in recreational activities or sports, right? The look good, feel good, play good? Or are you more interested in how resistance training can boost your mental capacity, make you more resilient? And the cool thing is that nobody says you have to pick just one goal, right? But if you have more than one goal, you have to be smart about how you go about your resistance training. And that's because the adaptations or the changes that happen from lifting weights are specific to what you do and how you do it. And this is where we get to clarify another misconception about resistance training is that resistance training is synonymous with strength training. And yes, lifting weights can be about getting stronger, and that is incredibly important, but it doesn't have to be. For example, with resistance training, that can be used to improve your body composition, to reduce your fat mass and tone up your muscles and reveal your underlying hidden physique by, again, reducing your fat mass and firming and toning, but not necessarily growing muscles. Or resistance training can be used to improve muscle size and density, and that's the muscle hypertrophy. Or you can use resistance training to take the size and strength that you have and simply improve your ability to use that size and strength over longer periods of time. And that's what we call muscular endurance. Or you can take the muscle you have now and you can train it to be faster and to have more power, which probably translates into improved recreational activities. And it can protect you from age-related decline. So resistance training isn't just about strength, and lifting weights won't automatically make you bulky, as we talked about in the last episode. It is possible to increase your strength quite significantly without ever really adding significant amounts of muscle mass. You get stronger, but you don't get bigger. So there's a lot of things that we could talk about. In fact, there are entire semester-long college courses on this very topic. But what I want to do is cut through some of the details that you don't need to know unless maybe you're a personal trainer, and get to the bottom line of what really matters if your goal is to improve some combination of muscle size, strength, power, and endurance, regardless of whether your goal is simply to look good, feel good, or play good, or you want to harness these other adaptations that happen within this global control system called the neuroendocrine immune supersystem. So one of the first things to sort out is to kind of know the lingo. And in order to do that, we have to cover some of the language of resistance training, because there are terms and phrases that are used in this field, and things will just be a lot easier and go smoother for you if you know some of the lingo. And so far, I've used words like mass or strength and power and endurance several times. Let me hit them again for better clarity. And remember that these, what I'm going to talk about now, these are the main adaptations or changes that come from doing resistance training in different ways, because you can do it so many different ways. So adaptation number one is hypertrophy. This is simply adding new muscle or growing your muscles. And I have to say something like, this is something that I have to talk to my lady clients about all the time. And I would say off the top of my head, maybe 8 out of 10 times when I do my initial assessment, I find that most of the women that I work with who come to me for health reasons, they are under-muscled. And if you do any research on your own about this, you're going to hear another related term, and that is muscle protein synthesis. And what you should know is that the muscle mass that you have right now is the result of the balance between two constant opposing forces, muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. So every moment of every day, you are making and breaking down muscle cells. And the amount of muscle that you have and the direction that you're going in terms of growth or loss is a reflection of the difference between these two processes, synthesis and breakdown. So if you're adding muscle because the net balance between making muscle is greater than breaking it down, then we say that you're in an anabolic state. You're growing and getting bigger. If the net balance says that you're breaking down protein faster than you're rebuilding it, then we call that a catabolic state, where you're losing stuff. And if your muscles are neither growing nor shrinking, your muscle protein synthesis and breakdown pathways are balanced. But if you're already under-muscled, being in balance is not such a great thing. You're just maintaining a physique where you are under-muscled. And if you're under-muscled, which I'm willing to bet many of you listening are, then you need to increase your anabolic or muscle protein synthesis activity so that it becomes greater than the forces that catabolize or break down your muscles. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, Doc, I've got too much muscle, or I just need to lose some muscle. I've never heard that. It doesn't happen. But the threat of being under-muscled is common, and it's very real. And the only way to get into an anabolic state where you grow muscle is to have two main things in place. The first is to have adequate quality protein in your diet, because muscle tissue is made from the amino acids that comes from animal products mostly in your diet. Plus, you have to have an adequate stimulus or signal going into these muscles that instructs them to take these amino acids from your diet and make more muscle. So how do you do that? Well, that's resistance training. Resistance training specifically that is organized or programmed to elicit the growth adaptation or to elicit hypertrophy. If we look across society, the masters of muscle hypertrophy are professional bodybuilders. Obviously, the professionals are pharmaceutically enhanced, but across the board, nobody in the world is better at building muscle better than bodybuilders. But, despite being the most muscular athletes in the world, and hence much stronger than the average person, bodybuilders are typically not as strong as power lifters. They're not as strong as Olympic lifters. And so in general, bigger muscles are stronger muscles, but bodybuilding style training optimizes for size, but doesn't optimize for speed, power, or strength. You train differently. If you want to have those things, you can't train exactly like a bodybuilder does. So that's adaptation number one, is muscle hypertrophy or growth. And again, the best example in the world is your professional bodybuilder. Adaptation number two, and this is just part of the lingo, is power, and I'm going to lump speed together And we're going to talk about power and speed together because they're so intimately connected. So if you're an exercise physiologist or if you're a well-informed clinician, don't crucify me here on the details. I know speed and power are two different things, but they're very much interlinked, and keeping them grouped together will do for our purposes in this conversation. So speed is simply the rate of movement. That's a concept that's pretty easy to grasp. If I'm lifting a light weight that's well under my maximum ability, I can easily perform the same exercise by doing it faster. So I can take a light weight and I can lift it very quickly, or I can lift it very slowly. In other words, it's very easy to lift light weights very quickly to increase your speed. But as the weight you're lifting approaches your maximum ability, you automatically slow down. Heavier weights are harder to move quickly. Even though you might be trying to move very quickly, heavy weights slow you down. And that's because it takes more power to lift a heavy weight with faster speeds. And this is why these two are interlinked. And again, technically speed and power are different, but they're yoked together such that you can produce more power one of two ways. You can lift the same weight faster, or you can lift a heavier weight at the same speed. And now, if we look at power and speed and ask who are the master athletes, the masters of speed and power, these are the Olympic lifters. These are the men and women who do things like the clean and jerk or the snatch. And these athletes might not be as muscular, say, as a bodybuilder, but they're far more powerful because they train to be able to lift heavy loads very quickly. So think of it this way. If my goal is to lift a modest to heavy weight from the floor to over my head in a single movement, I cannot do that slowly. It has to be done quickly, and that requires not just simply strength, it requires power and it requires speed. So we have hypertrophy and we have speed and power. The third adaptation I want to talk about is strength. And we can draw a distinction between absolute strength and relative strength, but absolute strength is typically expressed in the form of what we call a 1 rep maximum or a 1 rep max. And that is basically the maximum amount of force that you can exert in a given exercise or movement. In other words, no matter the type of exercise, what's the heaviest weight you can lift for exactly 1 repetition? And the classic question is like, bro, how much do you bench? This is a question of absolute strength. Like, what's the heaviest weight that you can push off your chest? Or someone might say, how much do you squat? How much do you deadlift? It's all about the same thing. But to be a little bit more technical, while we usually talk about strength in terms of this 1 repetition max, we can talk about strength for any given repetition count in any given exercise. For example, if I or you start out only able to lift a 15-pound weight 12 times, then your 12 rep max weight is 15 pounds. But if as a result of training, you can now lift 20 pounds for 12 repetitions, you have gotten stronger, and your 12 rep max has gone from 15 pounds to 20 pounds. So the idea of absolute strength is captured with this idea of a 1 repetition max, but the idea of relative strength applies to any other rep count. So for any given exercise, there will be a weight that you can only lift 5 times. That's your 5 rep max for that exercise. And there's going to be a weight that you can lift 25 times. That's your 25 rep max, and so on. Strength is good. Strength is desirable. And for most of you, getting stronger needs to be part of your goals. No matter what else you're thinking about, whatever you have in mind, being stronger is better. Whether it's primary goal or secondary is really up to you. There is a certain baseline of strength that you as a human living in a physical world need to have for basic functionality. But at some point, developing more strength is not going to serve more purpose in life. Right? At some point, you're going to have enough strength to do everything that you need to do, and perhaps have a little reserve left over in case of emergency, for example. And whatever that threshold is, getting stronger beyond that point only makes sense if being stronger and stronger and stronger is really what your goal is. If you're trying to become a strength athlete, or maybe it's just a matter of personal pride that you can lift a certain weight. It's a little bit addicting, and I hear from people over and over again, now that I feel stronger, I wonder how strong I can get. It's a very common thought process. So who are the masters of strength building? These are the power lifters. So bodybuilders are the masters of gaining muscle size. Olympic lifters are the elite the elite athletes and the masters of power and speed. But the masters of strength are the power lifters. And these are the men and women who, are sometimes insanely strong, often able to lift multiples of their body weight in 3 classic lifts, which are the bench press, the squat, and the deadlift. The cool thing is that you can train using the same exercises or movements that bodybuilders use. You can use the same exercises or movements that power lifters use. You can use the same exercises or movements that Olympic lifters use, but you would do it with less frequency, less intensity and volume, so that the adaptations give you what you want out of it without thinking like you have to become one of them. Or to say it another way, compared to these professionals, bodybuilders, powerlifters, and Olympic lifters, your training needs differ in intensity and volume, but not in kind. You need to do the same thing. You just don't do it at the level that would turn you into a bodybuilder, powerlifter, or Olympic lifter, unless that's your goal. And so the same training that these masters use to become the best in the world are the same things that you can use to become the best version of you that you can be. All right, adaptation number 4 that you need to know about is muscular endurance. And I said not long ago that muscular endurance is not the same as cardiorespiratory endurance. All right, the ultimate expression of cardiorespiratory endurance perhaps is your triathlete or your ultra marathoner who runs a 50-mile race in one shot. But have you ever considered the physiques of these athletes? Like most of them, especially the ultra marathoners, they're bone thin. And that's not a criticism, but rather it's a comment on how your body and your physique reflects your focus and training. In the last episode, I used the example of my shoulder rehab to illustrate the idea of muscular endurance, right? Now, that was truly local in the sense of I was talking about an expression of endurance that was localized to my shoulder muscles. So we can talk about local muscular endurance by literally focusing on a single muscle or a small group of muscles like the rotator cuff, part of the shoulder complex. Or we can take a larger view and talk about very large muscle groups such as your posterior chain. Experts might argue the finer points about exactly what's included in the posterior chain or what's not included, but essentially your posterior chain is the interconnected series of your hamstrings, your glutes, and your lower back. And essentially the very large muscles that allow you to stand up from a squat or from a chair, that propel you forward and even allow you to jump. And because larger groups of muscles working in concert have the ability to put a larger demand on the heart and lungs than, say, just the rotator cuff, you can improve heart and lung endurance by using these large muscle groups in specific ways. Ask anybody that has done high repetition back squats for, say, 20 reps at a time. Once they're done, their heart rate is up and they're breathing very, very hard. And in fact, old school lifters often called them breathing squats. So muscular endurance can be a phrase that's used to refer to very small muscle groups or very large muscle groups. And there are some exercises that use so many muscles at once that there is a great effect also on the heart and lungs because of the metabolic demand. Now, just as an aside, the exercises that use more than one joint and more than one muscle at a time are called compound exercise or compound exercises, whereas an exercise that isolates just one muscle and one joint at a time is called an isolation exercise. So, for example, compound exercises are things like squats and deadlift variations or different types of rowing movements, as well as, say, chest and shoulder presses. Those are compound exercises, many joints, many muscles, all with one movement. Isolation exercises would be things like bicep curls or tricep kickbacks or shoulder lateral raises. And honestly, each has its place, but you get more bang for your buck with these multi-joint, larger muscle compound exercise movements than you do with isolation. Doesn't mean isolation is bad. It's different. They serve different purposes. Now, I would argue that the masters of whole body muscular endurance are the elite athletes of the CrossFit world. And world-class CrossFitters are not the biggest in the world. They're not the strongest, nor are they the fastest or the most powerful. Most certainly, they are bigger, stronger, and faster than most of us. But what sets them apart from these other masters of, say, the lifting arts is their ability to go and go and go and go and go again. Their capacity for tremendous amounts of physical work over time is simply unbelievable. In fact, CrossFit was the first to offer what I consider to be a very practical working definition of fitness, and that is that fitness is increased work capacity across broad time and modal domains. And what that means is that while you're not an expert in any of the aspects of fitness, you are better than average at all of them. Now, having said that, I'm not telling you to run out and join a CrossFit gym, although I'm a big fan of their training approach. And back in the day when they first started, I did complete their level 1 coaching course when they just first got started. I did that for my own personal use and training myself and my kids when they were all still at home. And, very interestingly, good CrossFit gyms and good CrossFit trainers use a blend of techniques to develop all-around fitness. And the idea of all-around fitness is, quite often captured in the idea of what we call GPP, which is general physical preparedness. That's not unique to CrossFit, but I do feel that CrossFit was the first to systematize a training approach by gathering the best techniques from all these different training disciplines and putting them into one model of exercise and one model of fitness. Okay, enough about terminology for now. And let me close this episode by talking about an order of priorities. You have to sort some things out in your mind before you start an exercise program so that actually delivers what you want. So the first thing to sort out is the why, like we've already talked about, right? Chances are you want some combination of look good, feel good, play good, and that's wrapped up in the larger goal of being healthy and fit as you age, and probably doing that in limited time. And that has implications for exercise choice. So, first order priorities, figure out why you want or need to do this. And the second thing is, let's think about exercise choice, right? Because you can choose from any number of combinations of things, right? If your goal is general health and fitness and general wellness and longevity, you should choose to do those compound movements, the ones that use more muscles and joints at one time than isolation exercises. And in fact, most GPP programs, general physical preparedness programs, are built around these compound movements like squats, lunges, deadlifts, presses, and rows. And this is where you get most out of your time, especially if your time is limited. Now, if you don't know what these movements are, there's no shortage of demonstration videos online that you can Google, how do I do a back squat? How do I do a deadlift? And you'll come up with any number of instructional videos. Just, again, be smart and be safe. But I would also encourage you to think in terms of movements instead of muscle groups. Like a muscle-centric focus when choosing or thinking of exercise tends to lead you down the road of bodybuilding style exercise selection. Here's an example. Last summer, my sister and my brother-in-law started to work out at a local gym. And one day, as they were getting ready to head off to the gym, I asked what they were doing that day. And they said bis and tris, which is gym speak for biceps and triceps. If you don't know anatomy, these are the muscles on the front and back of your upper arm that bend and straighten your elbow. We call them curls and extensions as well. So in essence, they were going to spend their entire workout session working on two small muscle groups, training their arms. And that immediately told me a couple of things. First, they had unknowingly bought into a bodybuilding style of breaking their weekly workout sessions into body parts or muscle groups. So when I asked them more, they had one day that they exercised their legs, and then they had a day where they exercised their chest muscles, a day that they exercised their back muscles. They had an arm day and so on. And that's great if you want to become a bodybuilder, but they were training for health and wellness. And so there was a little bit of a disconnect there. And let's say their workouts tend to be very inefficient. So that was the first thing it told me. The second thing, when they said, hey, we're doing bis and tris today, I understand that their work is based on a ton of isolation work using smaller muscle groups and not the compound exercises that use more muscles and more joints in one movement. And so much better, especially as a beginner who's shooting for health and wellness, is to focus on these larger compound movements and not body parts. So you should consider not just using compound movements versus isolation movements, but to think in terms of a combination of lower body knee bending type exercises, which is something like a squat, or a lower body hip hinging exercise, which is some deadlift variation, especially when you couple those with an approach that says, hey, today I'm going to be doing upper body pushing movements, or I'm going to be doing upper body pulling exercises. And so this automatically gets us out of an isolation bodybuilding mentality of working bis and tris on one day and shoulders on another day into a movement-based, multi-joint, multi-muscle compound exercise that has the capacity to transform you. So again, think in terms of movements instead of body parts, and use compound exercises, not isolation. The next thing to sort out in terms of order of priority is exercise order within each session. And many people have a routine of, I do exercise 1, then I move to exercise 2, then I do exercise 3, and so on. And they execute what they're doing in the same order every single time. And as a beginner, that will still work. But if you happen to have a separate or a specific adaptation in mind that you're shooting for, or a weakness that you're working on, you have to prioritize that and do that first in your workout after your warm-up, and then everything else comes after that. Let's say, for example, that you realize that your lower body is actually plenty strong. You don't need to do much work there, even though it's still beneficial to work it. But maybe your upper body pulling movements are not as robust or strong as in comparison to everything else. And so you put your upper body pulling exercises in the beginning of your workout, and then everything follows after that. And finally, as we close, you have to think about exercise volume, which needs its own separate discussion. So I'm going to save that for the next episode, but let me give you just a little sneak peek. Once you've figured out what your big why is, why are you doing this? Why do you want to do resistance training? Once you have chosen specific exercises for lower body and upper body movements using compound exercises, and you know what your primary goal is, the next thing is to figure out how many sets and how many repetitions you need during each session and during the week to accomplish your goals. The truth is, you need a different volume, set, and repetition prescription for developing muscular endurance than you do if your goal is to increase your strength. You program things differently if you want a blend of strength and muscle gain versus purely developing, say, strength and power. So let's save that for the next episode. I truly hope that you can join me again. Thanks for being a listener, and we'll talk again here on the Inflammation Nation.
Thanks for listening to Inflammation Nation. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. You can use the links in the episode description to check out Dr. Noseworthy's self-learning programs for thyroid, detox, and gut health. Or you can submit a question for the podcast and even reach out to Dr. Noseworthy directly.